The police are meant to protect us from the worst of society. We trust them to uphold the law and keep us safe. But what happens when the protector becomes the predator?
He's performing as the protector of the public. On the other hand, he's actually a really dark monster.
Is that how you obtain this material?
And the people who are meant to keep us safe become dangerous.
I'm arrested on suspicion of attempted murder.
Even though you're a police officer, people will feel that they're above the law.
But how would you catch a criminal who thinks like a cop?
He's got a head start on the investigation team.
He's panicking at this point, and he's now running.
I've enlisted the help of 3 experts. 2 senior officers that have put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
Most people, they know when their back's against the wall and they're going to get convicted for something.
The horror, he's one of us.
And a leading psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
Underlying that anger is the need to dominate, is the need to control.
In this series, I'll discover cops who put themselves on the wrong side of the law,
He's like a Jekyll and Hyde character.
abuse their power, and commit horrific crimes.
He should never have had that badge, ever.
Keeping my kids safe is my top priority. The idea that someone would harm them is my worst nightmare. But for a cop to do it is a complete betrayal of trust. In December 2022, information is passed to South Wales Police that someone on their patch has been buying child sex abuse images online. The images are classed as Category A, the most serious that there is.
The feeling of betrayal you have, and shock, and upset, and sheer horror that someone has been doing this is really hard to get your mind around.
What I'm saying to you is when we examine this hard drive and this desktop computer, where we fully examine it, are we going to find evidence of you engaging in sexual communication with children?
No comment.
Inciting children to engage in sexual activity and sending you pictures and videos themselves?
No comment.
Indecent images and videos?
No comment.
Former Detective Chief Superintendent Fiona Mellor has investigated serious sex abuse offences throughout her 30-year career. She knows just how dangerous these offenders can be and how to get them off the street quickly. Where does the investigation start?
Intelligence is passed to the force around the use of a person at that stage using Bitcoin to purchase images of children in sexual abuse cases. And then that alerts the force and the Digital and Cyber Investigation Unit to start looking into it.
The suspect has been using Bitcoin to buy explicit images of children, some as young as 10.
He was operating on the dark web, which is a protected environment, highly sophisticated, highly guarded by those who use it. Then shortly after New Year that year, the team received another piece of intel that the same person is then uploading images onto Snapchat. But then what this gives the team is the IP address, which means they get a name and they can start looking and they discover the subject is actually a serving police officer in South Wales Police, Lewis Edwards.
What do they do next?
Suddenly, the shock, the feeling of, he's one of us. We have got to act quickly. So apart from the disbelief and the shock and the horror, it's the professionalism that kicks in straight away. All the training, all the knowledge, all your experience, straight away. We've got to secure the evidence and we've got to get hold of Edwards.
The race is on to build a case and arrest 23-year-old cop Lewis Edwards before he gets wind of the investigation and tries to destroy any incriminating evidence.
It's critical at this time to keep the information safe. So they limit it to a number of people, experts working in that digital team, because they can't afford for it to leak out and for Edwards to be alerted. So they protect the information and then they start planning how they're going to now get to the home address, secure evidence and make the arrest.
It takes the team 6 weeks to build their case in secret. All the while, Lewis is working as a police officer, with no idea that his colleagues are onto him. Then, on February the 8th, 2023, Edward's family home in Bridgend is raided. The officers are stunned by what they find.
He's in bed, he's got 2 phones with him, but they also found a huge office of digital complex machines, drives, hardware, storage facilities, where he'd been using to set up his own digital camp, if you like, which is highly complex.
Edwards is taken away for questioning by his fellow officers, who he'd been working alongside just days before. I'm just on my way to South Wales to meet someone who knows his case better than most. And I just hope he can shed some light on how a serving police officer can get away with what Edwards did right under their noses. No one noticed. Philip Dewey is a local journalist who followed the story closely. What's it like round here?
It's quite a sort of tight-knit community in Bridgend. Everyone seems to know each other. Sort of gossip travels quite fast.
What kind of police officer was Lewis Edwards?
Edwards first became a police officer in 2021. As a young man, he was just beginning his career in the force. He was a very isolated person, kept himself to himself. He lived with his parents, and a lot of the time he'd spend his time in his bedroom on his computer. Outside of his work with the police, I don't think many people would have known him.
So when the community found out about what's been going on in this area, how did they react?
I think it was just utter disbelief that this person was a police officer. Obviously, they're the people you go to for help, they're the people who are there to protect you. I think it was just utter disbelief in how could have this happened in our town.
Edwards sounds like a loner outside of work. What do we know about his career with the police? What would he do on a day-to-day basis?
He was in his probationary stage, which is where you're your learning and your training stage. He would have also been seeing members of the public and answering calls and being tutored through that process.
If he's going through his probation period, that means he's only just gone through vetting.
Yes, so all the checks would have been done in terms of his background, his family home, his education, and he'd have passed and carried on.
Surely there must have been somebody, either one of his colleagues or in his past at school or in the neighbourhood, who pointed out that they thought there was something wrong with Lewis Edwards.
Nothing has come to light at all. There were no sort of flags around worrying behaviour, people feeling uncomfortable. There were no information reports or intelligence reports from any of his background. You still have an image of what paedophiles look like. And it's not somebody in a raincoat on the street corner, you know, an old person, potentially, you know, the stereotype. It's not. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and it's a really obvious thing to say, but it's the shock. This person doesn't look like that, fit that mould, do that job.
As a police officer, Edwards knew full well what he was doing was wrong, and he'd figured out exactly how to keep his despicable secret from those around him. It's up to the investigators to get the evidence they need before it's lost for good.
The amount of knowledge, experience he's got as a relatively young man is frightening. He had confidence because he could get rid of it at the touch of a button, remotely, and no one would know.
Police officer Lewis Edwards' home in Bridgend has been raided, following intelligence that he'd been purchasing child sexual abuse images online. To help me understand where investigators would even start with something like this, I'm speaking to retired Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves. He's got over 34 years' experience investigating serious crime, including child sex abuse cases. I want to find out what would have happened when Edward's colleagues came knocking on his door.
They would have explained to him what the investigation was about, that they were looking to recover devices such as computers, laptops, phones, and give him the opportunity to explain where those items may be. The specialists that were looking at those devices were reasonably confident that they had been encrypted. Edwards was making sure that if anybody else got hold of those items, they wouldn't be able to access them.
So Edwards probably thought, I'm safe here, they're not looking for me.
Of course. So once the officers get the search warrant, not only do they have detectives and uniformed officers that attend, they'll also have officers who are expert at looking at devices, and then they have the necessary equipment to download the information before they take the computer away. They're hoping that on those items are the images and transactions that he's done via the web, so that's critical to the investigation. Actually, just physically having those items is one part of it, but it's actually what is contained is even more important.
But Edwards is savvy. Not only is his tech encrypted to obstruct prying eyes, he's gone to great lengths to prevent the police ever getting the evidence that he knows they need.
The digital setup he had at his home address was so sophisticated. Officers stayed there for 2 to 3 days, determined to recover all of the evidence.
Edwards isn't stupid. I mean, he's been planning this. He's been meticulous with this.
He's a highly organised individual, but he takes it to the next level. So he knows if he's at work, for example, and someone puts a phone call in, or someone comes into his house or gets access to his bedroom where he's all set up, the rig he's got is that it can be sort of tripwired if he's not there and all closed down, and all the imagery will be lost, saving him.
So if somebody went in there and tried to turn it on or whatever, everything would be wiped?
Yes.
That takes a lot of intelligence to be able to set something up like that. I wouldn't even know where to begin to encrypt my devices, let alone have a system to remotely destroy my files. Where did Edwards get all this know-how?
I know we talk a lot about police officers having knowledge and experience, but a lot of times that information is out there in the public domain. You can do your own research on a lot of this stuff.
Do you think Edwards thought he was one step ahead?
Yeah, I'm sure Edwards felt he was one step ahead of the game. But in the fullness of time during the course of that investigation, he'd have realized that, you know, I'm gonna hide into nothing.
Edwards thought that even if his colleagues came for him, he'd be able to dig his way out. And when it came to covering his tracks, he thought he was way ahead of them. How did he respond when the police finally went and arrested him?
When police did finally arrive at Edward's home, he was quite calm, quite collected. He didn't react in a strange manner. When he was asked questions, he didn't really respond. He was asked to give his PIN number and said, I don't want to do that now.
Despite Edwards refusing to cooperate, police experts managed to break his encryption, access his devices, and start cataloguing the crucial evidence. What did they find?
4,500 images of children in compromising positions.
4,500 images?
Yeah. Not only was he in possession of that many images, he had also categorized them into folders based on their age and based on what was depicted on those images.
So, you're talking about somebody here who's obsessed with children?
I think obsessed is exactly the right way to look at it. Bearing in mind he was a police officer, there are even times when he was on duty, the records show that he was actually looking at some of those images.
Investigators discover over 30 occasions where he'd accessed this material whilst on duty. It's unbelievable.
We know he spent majority of his time on the internet, even when he was at work, and you would think he was doing police business.
So he was an absolute monster.
Yes, he was.
As a cop, Edwards thought that staying silent would be the best way to avoid incriminating himself and prevent his former colleagues from building their case against him.
People search the internet to find indecent images of children. Is that how you obtain this material?
No comment.
Do you other means we know are like via the dark web? People access the dark web.
No comment.
Is that how you go about obtaining this type of material?
No comment.
You know, you've got to be professional, but with your fathers out there, you know, who've got daughters, and knowing that Lewis Edwards has been working amongst you, there must be a human response there.
There is a human response. On those occasions, those senior officers are then going to have to be going back. They would have had maybe confidential conversations with some of his colleagues, just to build up a picture to see whether anybody could actually say, yeah, you know what, I had my misgivings about a particular thing. So they would want to make sure that, you know, there weren't opportunities to have dealt with him before, and they hadn't.
The scary thing about this is that this was all going on right under the noses of his friends and his family and his work colleagues, and no one had any idea what he was up to. Sadly, this isn't the end of the story.
The digital team find thousands of images of girls aged between 10 and 16. And within that, they then find further offences.
The images were just the tip of the iceberg. Collecting 4,500 indecent images of kids is bad enough, but things were about to get even worse.
They discover Edwards is not only buying child sexual images, he's also making them himself and distributing them.
They ascertained that Edwards had groomed in excess of 200 children, girls, with numerous conversations, and asked them for pictures. But in addition to that, he'd also employed the use of sophisticated screening capability and recording capability for the snapshots. So therefore, when he was speaking and grooming and conversing with his victims, they didn't know they were being recorded.
He had actually incited girls as young as 10, up to the age of 16, to commit, you know, sexual acts on themselves. I think to start with, he would have probably just sent harmless photos to them, you know. It could be anything. And then eventually, once he was happy and confident around them, and he knew that they were confident in him, that's when he would have started to ask for images of the girls.
I mean, it must be a horrendous job having to go through the files that they find.
They also found out that he had actually set up fake accounts on Snapchat, and that was for the purposes of ensuring that he could then identify girls as young as 10 up to 16.
What I'm hearing is just terrifying. These are someone's daughters, totally innocent and naive. Edwards is presenting himself as a teenager to trick them and manipulate them into doing things that no young girl should be doing.
Edwards, in order to gain the trust of the girls he was speaking to, presented himself as a 14-year-old boy.
The photos he used to portray himself online were a far cry from who the girls were actually talking to.
Spoke to them about problems in his own life, claimed that he was having a tough sort of upbringing, having a tough home life, and that this conversation with this particular girl was sort of saving him, and it was preventing him from killing himself.
So he was gaining their trust before he was going to finally get them to do these horrendous things for him.
Yeah, that was the key thing. He had to gain their trust, and the best way of doing that was to come across as a vulnerable teenager like the people he was speaking to.
Have you ever come across anybody in your profession of what you're doing in reporting like this?
The scale that Edwards went into is something I haven't seen before.
For the tight-knit community in Bridgend, it must have been like a bomb going off. A paedophile hiding in plain sight, working as a cop. Following his arrest in February 2023, Edwards continues stonewalling his colleagues.
When he was interviewed, Edwards answered no comment to all questions, which was his right, but in my opinion showed a certain arrogance that he didn't have to provide an explanation for what he had done. Officers asked him a range of questions about how he came into this world, what he'd been searching for in the dark web, how he had managed to get his victims to do this, and most importantly, why he had done this. But again, to all questions, he answered no comment.
Another method might be to directly communicate with the child, whether that be using a profile suggesting you're an adult, or profile suggesting you yourself may be a child, and then getting children to send material, what we would call first generation material, to you. Is that how you obtain your images and your decent images?
I actually feel for his colleagues in the police. First, the shock of having served alongside him, but then having to go through all the images, and the horror of what he did would have sunk in. It'd been terrible.
The team continue to interrogate the imagery, and they view it over 2 to 3 months. They're really, really thorough. But what comes next is far, far worse.
In early 2023, South Wales Police discovered that one of their own officers has not only been buying child sexual abuse images on the dark web, but also grooming children, pretending to be a teenager and getting them to send explicit photos and videos. I can't get my head round it. My kids are on social media, and all this stuff about Edwards has got me worried about what they might be seeing, or who they might be chatting to. I want to find out more, and I'm hoping tech expert Dan Serdegren can help. Lewis Edwards was caught because he was on the dark web and he was buying images of children. Can you explain what the dark web is?
The dark web is a load of interconnected technology which acts like the internet, yes, but you can't get on it without sophisticated kit.
And what's it used for?
A lot of the dark web use is for illegal activities. So you can buy all sorts of things on there. It can be guns, it can be drugs, it can be all sorts of things. So unfortunately, a lot of criminals use the dark web. We've got some screenshots here on the dark web, and you can see you can buy weapons, you can buy drugs, you can buy guns and ammo. It's quite blatant what's there. And the reason why it can be so blatant, of course, is it's so hard to trace and so hard to track.
What I don't understand is, if it's selling stuff that's illegal, why can't they just shut it down?
Saying that is a bit like saying, how do we shut down the sky? Bad things happen in the sky, therefore we shut down the sky. It can't be done. The internet will always be there, and the dark web, just like the normal web, is likely always to be there. It's almost impossible to shut the whole thing down.
Edwards was pretending to be a 14-year-old boy to lure these young girls in. I mean, is that how easy it is? Just pretending to be somebody else?
Well, when you sign up to a lot of social media sites, they're simply going to say, put in your age. You could say you were 18 when you were younger. You could put in a variety of different things into there, of course, and my guess, of course, is he was saying he was a lot younger. It's literally just a click away, and you could be almost any age you want.
I'm disgusted by the fact that all this stuff was being done by a police officer, someone who is supposed to uphold the law. Edwards knew what he was doing was wrong, and yet he carried on, with zero regard for the girls he was abusing or the community he was meant to be serving. But what Edwards would go on to do with the illegal pictures he gathered was just plain evil.
Edwards gets more confident, more aggressive, more threatening, more controlling. And he goes back to those victims he'd first engaged with and asks them for pictures, but now he threatens them. So he begins a campaign of blackmail against those victims to ensure he has a continual supply of imagery.
What sort of a person does that? I mean, he's a police officer. Edward's position of trust and authority hasn't stopped him from breaking the law. He's not only been grooming underage girls online, he's also been blackmailing them. It's sickening. This is a grown man pushing young girls to do stuff they don't understand or want to do, making them believe they have no choice.
He won't let up, he won't stop. In fact, he found in his home address is a blackmail manual where he's really sort of progressing in his offending, which is really worrying in terms of how far this was going to go.
So he's reading up on how he can blackmail young girls and get them to do what he wants them to do.
This is the worry, in that how he's moved from collecting, capturing and sharing, he's now hurting people. I've got 30 years in as a police officer, but when you consider young girls pleading and crying for their lives, in one case, a girl says, "I've got my GCSEs tomorrow, please, can it stop?" And he says, no, carry on, I'm gonna hurt you, carry on. And she says, "But I just want it to stop, please make it stop." And that's just one example of hundreds.
This is beyond comprehension. Edward's predatory behaviour is so horrific, it's like nothing I've ever heard before.
He threatened to post these images online for all to see or to send them to family and friends. And obviously these girls were very young and just scared about that happening. So in order to keep him happy, they were required to send even more obscene images of them taking part in sexual acts, including masturbation, involving hairbrushes and straighteners. And in a lot of these images, the children were very distressed, crying, begging for him to stop. Yeah, they were some of the worst examples of indecent images of children you can get.
Seems like Edwards felt untouchable. He thought his victims would never tell. He thought the police would never trace him. He was cocky. And what makes me angry is that he felt that secure.
His MO was basically threats. You know, if you don't do what I want you to do, I am going to do something that you're not going to like. I'm going to mete out violence to you, your family members, your friend. I'm going to burn your house down.
Didn't any of the children that he was grooming say anything to the families or the parents or anything?
There was one particular girl who she was in conversation with Edwards on her phone, and she was that distressed that she went to see her father and handed him the phone. And the father then spoke to what he thought was a 14-year-old, James, and said, "Look, can you stop what you're doing? Please stop." And Edward's response was laugh out loud, like, you know.
What, like lol?
Yeah, lol, you know, laugh out loud. I'm, you know, showing no compassion or anything for what was happening.
Is that because he probably thought that the young girl was pretending to be the dad?
Yeah, so what the father then did, he sent a picture of himself and said, "No, this is actually me talking to you. You need to stop this." At which point, Edwards made a comment along the lines of, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to send it anywhere else." So that's the only time that you think Edwards is thinking to himself, "Oh, my dear, how is this going to impact on me going forward?"
So he wasn't worried about the girl. He was more worried about himself if her dad outed him. Edwards, for me, is beyond vile. I hate anyone messing with innocent people, especially children. and all for his own sexual gratification, tormenting them, bullying them, blackmailing them, to tears, begging him, and he didn't stop. To help me understand the twisted mind of this predator in uniform, I'm meeting with psychologist Serena Simmons. They're the lowest of the low, these kind of people, and he was a police officer. Is that his cover to go, look, I'm respectable, I'm a police officer, no one's going to look for me?
Well, I think what having the role as police officer did was it allowed the world to keep away. It kept a facade up to the rest of the world that he was an upstanding citizen, a professional. I think every day that Edwards went into work and interacted with other people, he was acting, because I think Edwards got most of his pleasure and his focus in his life was what he did behind the scenes. I think everything that gave him enjoyment in life was committing these despicable acts. Everything else was just a function, really, of that. It enabled him to live his rich fantasy life. I think this is a very, very dangerous young man, very dangerous. The bits that I think are particularly fascinating about his profile is the sadistic elements of his crimes. He really, really focused on humiliation of those young girls. And I think he really wanted to enjoy having control and dominance over them. And I think really what that tells us about him is that there wasn't really much going on in his real life.
You don't take children's innocence away. He was doing it in the worst possible way and making them feel bad about it as well and getting off on it.
He caused great, great anxiety in those poor young girls who were victim to what he was doing. I think we need to remember that someone like Edwards is getting all of their pleasure and the thrill from doing these very, very things. It's really hard for us to make sense of that, because how could you be so cruel? How could someone get excitement and enjoy that process?
Does he not think for 1 second the damage he's doing to these young girls?
I don't think he cares for 1 second that he's hurt them. We have to always remember the victims here and remember that they have been through something deeply traumatic.
There were over 200 girls that he was in contact with. The investigation didn't just happen in his local area. 15 different police forces across the UK were actually involved in that investigation.
It is unbelievable. As the young girls struggle with the trauma of what they've endured, the police are meticulously piecing together a case against Edwards, even as he continues to stay silent.
Are we going to find evidence of you engaging in sexual communication with children?
They know that ultimately, if he sticks to that course all the way through to trial, that at the end of the day, the judge will say to the jury, you, the jury, you can make your own inference from his silence.
On the 26th of May 2023, South Wales police officer Lewis Edwards was charged with over 160 counts relating to child sexual offences. Yet he continues to say nothing. With the evidence mounting up, I'm not sure that's the best line of defence.
I've managed hundreds and hundreds of covert operations, particularly using digital capability. And you know, once the digital evidence is there, it is very, very hard to go not guilty. It's really, because the evidence is there, your name's on it, your face is often on it, your voice is on it. You can be digitally put into that place at the time. There's very little wiggle room for you to start explaining, because what can you explain? Those police officers in South Wales worked tirelessly to get that evidence and get him to court. He pleaded before he got to court. He had nowhere to go, so he had to plead guilty.
At hearings in May and September 2023, Edwards pleads guilty to 160 separate offences. But what about his career in the police force?
South Wales police take a really robust approach and they suspend him immediately. The long-lasting impact of being dismissed through a misconduct panel such as that is that Edward is on a barred list from ever joining the police service again or being put in a position of trust.
Besides the shame of being thrown out of the police force, he was also due in court on the 23rd of October 2023 for sentencing, as local and national press descended on Cardiff Crown Court.
For 2 days, this court had listened to accounts and watched recordings of the trauma, abuse and panic these and so many other girls had suffered, much of which is simply too harrowing to report. Hiding his identity, posing as a teenage boy, he'd contacted more than 200 girls on social media, including Snapchat, on 30 occasions, even while at work.
It was very, very busy in the courtroom. Obviously, there was a lot of members of the press like myself there, barristers and the judge. The only person who was missing was Lewis Edwards, who refused to leave his cell.
So Edwards didn't go to court?
No, he refused to attend. He basically refused to leave his cell and didn't want to appear in public for his sentencing, which was sort of the ultimate insult to the victims and their families.
Why do you think he didn't want to be in court?
I think he just didn't want to face the reality of the situation, ultimately to avoid scrutiny. Obviously, there would have been a lot of prying eyes in the courtroom looking at him, judging him as a sentence was passed. So I think he cowardly refused to accept the situation and just remained in his cell. The public gallery was packed with victims and members of their families, and statements were read out by the mothers of some of the victims in court, which were very powerful to hear.
It even further tells me how much of a coward he is. He's done all this to all these innocent people, and he couldn't even go and face their families and them in court.
What sticks in my mind the most is watching the videos in court of the victims as they were being abused by Edwards. Just hearing them crying, begging for help, begging for him to stop what he was doing. Obviously, the video was pixelated, but hearing their sort of cries for help and pleading with Edwards will just something I'll never forget.
We have a really, really powerful statement from one of the young girls. If I just read it to you, she says, "I was only a little girl. I feel confused, embarrassed, disgusted, and I have no self-esteem. I lost my innocence, I feel guilty, and I still struggle to trust people." An incredibly, incredibly sad statement, and yet it probably encapsulates how so many of those young girls are feeling at this point, because although this was a fleeting thing for Edwards, this is something that he did for pleasure, this is something that these young girls are going to live with for the rest of their lives.
The level of danger posed to children by the defendant is very high. I am satisfied that that risk will continue long into the future, and it is not possible to say when that risk will cease.
In heartbreaking statements read to the court, many of Edwards' victims described feeling dirty and ashamed, as well as suffering ongoing mental health problems. Many parents told of their children becoming withdrawn and even self-harming. Handing Edwards from Kevin Glass in Bridgend a life sentence today with a minimum term of 12 years, the judge told him he was a psychologically manipulative predator.
Even though Edwards told the court he was sorry for his actions, former Detective Chief Superintendent Fiona Mallon doesn't buy it, and she thinks he's got off lightly.
He's sentenced for 12 years, after 4,500 images had been found. 12 years.
12 years. They cannot let Lewis Edwards back on the street. They can't. It's too dangerous, in my opinion.
We should be thinking far, far, far higher in terms of 30, 40 years, because they will come out and they will offend again.
And that, I'm sorry for what I've done. Do you believe that? Do you believe he actually is remorseful?
He wasn't sorry when he was watching 10-year-old girls insert implements into their bodies, making them bleed. He wasn't sorry when girls were crying, asking him to stop. And he wasn't sorry when others were screaming and hysterical and in pain. He didn't stop then, so why would he stop now?
Although Edwards made his half-hearted apology and even had the gall to try and get his sentence reduced, he refused to reveal the identity of those he was sharing these horrific images with. But what about those young girls who were subject to PC Edwards' depraved ways? What happens to them?
It's not unusual for people and young people in this situation who've experienced abuse of this nature, and it is really significant abuse, to feel quite generally those feelings of shame and guilt. And they'll have to work on those for a long time. So really, these young people will need a lot of support to process what's happened.
There's one thing about these young innocent girls trusting people, but again, the trust in the police. This was someone who's supposed to protect you. This is someone your family bring you up to say, if you have any problems, find a policeman, they'll look after you. You know, that's what I used to tell my kids. Now, what's this going to do to that?
I think it's very natural for these young girls to feel that their trust has been eroded when they see a police officer, and just in general how they might relate to the police. So I think this is now the job of the police to rebuild their reputation, to rebuild people's trust in them. So there's a lot of work ahead, I think, for the police in kind of making that happen.
Edwards isn't the only cop who's been found guilty of child sexual abuse offences. In the past 3 years alone, police officer Mark Rosebery from Greater Manchester Police and retired cops Jeremy Laxton and Jack Addis from the Met have also been jailed. But despite public criticism, South Wales Police believe there was nothing more they could have done before employing Edwards.
I understand there will be people asking how Edwards could have joined the police at the same time he was committing these terrible crimes. At the time of him joining South Wales Police, his vetting was clear, and there was nothing to indicate that he was involved in such abhorrent offences against children.
This case has really affected me. It's just the thought of kids as young as 10, and they're going to have to live with this for the rest of their lives. And their parents discovering what he did to them under their own roof, and they couldn't protect them from this predator. It's horrendous. But at least Edwards is in prison, and that's exactly where he should be.